just so we make sure it gets done. And it'll be available for viewing after the conference. Live transcription has been enabled, and you can turn it on or off using the live transcript feature. You can change the view by clicking on the view button in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We recommend the speaker view. And at the close of the presentation, I will be putting an assessment survey in the chat box. We'd appreciate it if you'd fill that survey out for each session you attend. And I will now turn it over to the speaker, and I'll let him introduce what he's going to talk about and himself or anything he wants to share with us.
Okay.
Go away with it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark McKnight, in case you hadn't caught that yet. Welcome to my presentation. So you want to hear a story, eh? How storytelling contributes to scholarship. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we tell stories in the first place. Well, first I'm going to introduce myself. First, I'm going to take a little bit of time to introduce myself, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we tell stories in the first place, then why you should consider telling stories in your classroom. And then last, we're going to talk about how to put together your own stories for use in your classes. Then we'll finish up with some tips to keep in mind while you're putting together your stories, and I'll field any questions that you might have. So without further ado, let's get started. So who the heck am I, and why should you care? Like I said at the top, my name is Mark McKnight. I'm the Outreach and Instruction Librarian for Cornet Library. I've been at Cornet Library for almost 5 years now, working on student outreach programs and as the primary purveyor of library instruction. In fact, when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them that I teach people how to use the library. So that's become a part of who I am. Before that, I worked for Amarillo Public Library as a reference librarian for 3 years, which in a way is just another version of a teaching librarian, because in that job, I was responsible for hosting outreach programs, many of which took on the form of a craft of some sort. And if you've never tried to teach a group of little old ladies who are confident that they know all there is to know about every craft imaginable, you better be on your teaching A game. Before that, I worked at Amarillo Independent School District for 3 years, teaching English language arts to middle schoolers. During that time, I was known in my admittedly very small neck of the woods as the go-to person for teaching poetry. Again, if you're going to try and teach the finer points of poetry to a bunch of 6th graders, you better bring your A game. So I've spent about 11 years in education and librarianship, with 8 of those years focused primarily on teaching. Basically, I've spent a lot of time in front of people trying to get information across to them. And the primary tool I've used to teach is through storytelling. So storytelling is something I've used professionally for a long time. But the storyteller in me comes from even further back in my history. I come from a family of storytellers, not professional storytellers, though if any of my relatives decided that they wanted to take on that profession, they would probably do a pretty fair job of it. Conversations in my family growing up were never straightforward affairs. It has always been an opportunity to swap stories of what is going on in your life. And heaven forbid, if the person you were talking to found out that you left anything out, they'd be mad at you for months, even if it was an accident. My point to all this is to say I've spent some time in front of people, and I've spent a good portion of that time telling stories. Mostly those stories were about myself, but sometimes, like we'll talk about in a little bit, they were entirely made up. Still, storytelling as a way to communicate has always been an incredibly effective tool for me. And I think it can be a very effective tool for you too, as long as you're intentional with it. So now that you know a little bit more about me, let's jump into the presentation proper. So why do we tell stories? In preparation for this presentation, I read many articles trying to figure out why we humans tell stories. While I was digging into this, I was greeted with platitude after platitude about how we tell stories because we are human, and telling stories makes us more human. Basically, it's just hardwired into us. This is just something we've always done. One article said we were drawn to stories because they provided us with a way to make sense of the world around us. We use stories to calm the shadows around us. They help us organize and interpret the information that we take in. Stories help us form connections with those around us, create a sense of community, and build bridges between people from different backgrounds and cultures. We tell stories to inspire people. We tell stories to empathize with people, and we tell stories to entertain. Stories serve so many cultural roles for us that it was difficult to pin down an answer to the question of why we tell stories. So I thought I would approach it from the angle of why I personally tell stories. Several years ago, before I became a librarian, I taught middle school English. I thought I wanted to be a middle school librarian, and to do that in Texas, in case you haven't looked into it, you have to teach for 2 years. So into the classroom I went. Long story short, teaching was not my life's calling. I struggled to keep my head above water. When you're just trying to survive, you don't have room in your brain to do anything other than what comes most naturally. For me, that was storytelling. Like I said before at the beginning of the presentation, I come from a family of storytellers. My dad is a prolific storyteller. Every day he would come home and tell my mother about his entire day. Then he would pull stories of how mine and my brother's days were at school while we sat around the dinner table. So by the time I became a teacher, telling stories had become my default setting. Especially as my dad and grandfather and aunts and uncles relayed many of the lessons that they taught me as a kid through stories. Stories from their childhood, stories of other family members and their antics. It became how I learned many of the life lessons. So when I was in front of a classroom full of middle schoolers and I was struggling to keep sane, I reverted to the thing that I am most well versed in. I spent a decent chunk of my time as a teacher going through what would be taught the next day and seeing how I could relate what I would be teaching to pieces of my life. Either that, or I was trying to come up with fictional stories of crazy characters to relate the concept of the day to my students. Yeah, you gotta love those middle schoolers, don't you? So telling stories became the tool I used to get by in my 3 years of teaching. Telling stories is now how I try to relate many of the information literacy concepts that I teach on a day-to-day basis. So why should you consider using stories in your classroom? One day, back in my old 6th grade classroom, I was attempting to teach my students the concept of hyperbole. I was struggling with this particular lesson because I hadn't been able to come up with a story from my life the night before to relay the lesson to my students, at least not one that I could tell a bunch of 6th graders. So my students were struggling because having someone drone on about any topic when you're 11 or 12 is boring. I'm also reasonably sure that I was droning because I hadn't quite mastered the art of acting excited about something that is inherently not exciting. Then it happened. In the back of the room, the thing that middle school teachers dread more than anything. A student yawned. I say he yawned. His mouth went so wide that I saw his tonsils in the back of his throat. It was shocking. Okay. I stopped mid-sentence. As far as I was concerned, there wasn't any point in continuing with the lesson because they weren't listening anyway. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. On any other day, I might have just plowed through the lesson, hoping that at least one of them would remember what I'd said. But instead, on this day, I just stared out from the wall of windows in my 2nd floor classroom. I don't really have an explanation for what happened next, other than I was slapped in the back of the head by one of the muses. I said to no one in particular. My uncle would survive a fall from up here. And then I just let it hang in the air. About 30 seconds later, one of the kids in the back of the room said, "Nuh-uh." "Yeah, huh," I said. "No way, Mr. McKnight, you storying." "No, really. You see, my uncle had extra stretchy skin, so he would bounce when he fell. So if he fell out the window, he'd probably just bounce right back up here." "That's crazy, Mr. McKnight." I know, but it's all true. I'm not exaggerating at all. But if I was, that story would definitely be hyperbole. I was home free, and it looked like they were going to get this information after all. At least I thought I was home free until one of the kids asked what my uncle's name was. See, to this point in my teaching career, I had only ever shared stories about myself, so they had no reason to believe that I was making any of this up. "Oh, you want his name? His name was Jim Bob." I could have stopped there, but again, for reasons I still do not understand, I just kept going. "His name was Jim Bob Billy Bo Jean." "Wow, Mr. McKnight, that's a really long name." "Yeah, I know. Granny was a creative woman." "There's no way his name was that long," said a little girl up in the front of the room who rarely spoke up in class. I was shocked because, again, I don't think I'd heard her speak in front of the other students in the 3 months that I'd been teaching. But she said that with some serious conviction. Everyone in the room was staring very intently as she said, "You just made that up. I bet you can't say it again." Well, I took a deep breath, hoped for the best because I wasn't sure if I could rattle it off again, and guessed. And it just so happens I actually got it right. And just like that, a new uncle was born. The problem was that a new uncle was born. Now my students wanted to know more about this relative with the funny name. This meant I had to keep coming up with stories about this character that had things to do with whatever we were learning. Suddenly, I was married to using this character. Not that that was a bad thing, it's just where we ended up as a class. So what did my students gain from me telling these stories in class? Well, for one, it lowered the temperature in the room. By that I mean teaching through a story made my students feel like the stakes weren't as high as they probably were. I mean, how serious can this stuff be if I'm telling stories about a weird made-up uncle? They became, or as a general rule, they were more engaged if I was telling a story. They became invested in what I was talking about because, if nothing else, they wanted to know how the story ended. It tied what they were learning to an emotion. This has actually been shown to help students retain what they're learning. If you need proof that this works, think back to a time whenever you were incredibly happy. And think about how much more vivid that memory is over a normal day. Or conversely, think about a time whenever you were incredibly embarrassed or scared. How vivid is that memory? My point is, tying what someone is learning to an emotion helps retain what you've told them. I wouldn't necessarily suggest tying what they're learning to embarrassment and or fear, but the stronger the emotion, definitely the more tied they are to that memory. Telling a story is a quick and effective way to build a community within that classroom. Creating a community within your classroom, even one you won't be in for very long, because let's face it, as librarians, we're usually only in there for one session, has several benefits. First, it fosters a certain level of trust and safety within that space, which helps your students take in information. Second, there's an old adage in teaching that states that they don't care what you know until they know that you care. Sharing stories with your students, especially ones that are personal to you, goes a long way towards showing them that you care. Third, by taking a moment to foster a mini community in the class you're teaching, you'll help your students feel comfortable asking for help from you later. They will feel like they know you at least a little bit. And if they know you and they're walking across the library trying to find someone to help them and they see you, they're going to think to themselves, that person is approachable. I know them at least on some small level, and feel far more comfortable walking up to you if they really need the help. So we've talked about why we tell stories and why you should consider telling stories in your classroom. Now let's talk about how to tell a story, or actually how to create a story to tell. I once read Stephen King's autobiography / writing advice book called On Writing. If you've never picked it up, you should really consider picking it up. It's incredible. In that book, King states that writing a story is as easy as writing an action, then simply writing what happens next, then what happens after that, and so on, until you've told the whole story. While that seems like a great way to write a long story, it doesn't feel like it works for what we want to do, which is to tell a quick story to showcase a skill or explain why you should or shouldn't do a thing. To that end, I created a formula to help us build a short story for use in teaching. We're going to go over that formula, but I believe, Babette, did you put it in the chat?
What was that, sir?
The teaching formula. Did I send that to you?
No.
Or not the teaching, yeah, I did not.
No, sorry.
Okay.
But you're welcome to share it.
That's okay. Hang on just a moment. Let me see if I can get a link to that formula. I don't know if that will actually, there we go. Let me set it to anyone, apply that, and send it. Okay. So in the chat, there is a Word document that is a formula for how to put together a story to use in your classroom. Feel free to use this any way you choose. You don't have to, these are not necessarily hard and fast rules, but I'm going to go over that.
Mark, it said it didn't work.
Oh, dang it all.
Sorry.
Well, my
You
computer.
want to email it to me and I'll put it in there?
Sure, I can do that. Can I actually, okay, so instead of, it's linked from the conference portal. Oh, okay, cool. Thank you, Erin.
Okay.
And thank you for dropping that in there for me. Thank you for helping me out.
Thank you, Erin.
I appreciate it. So if you'd like to follow along, feel free to click on that link and we'll go over that formula together. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out what lesson we're trying to teach. That'll help us decide which story we would like to tell. Let's say that I want to teach a lesson about workshopping our search terms to ensure that they are the right words. Now that I know what lesson I want to teach, I have to think of a time when workshopping my search terms helped me in my life. Or I can think of a time when not using workshop search terms hurt me. Okay. So for my example, I'm thinking of when I helped my friend David look for images detailing how to put away a complex board game. Now I know the lesson I'm going to teach and the story I want to tell to get that point across. The story I've decided to tell becomes my conclusion or punchline to that story. Again, I help my friend David look for images detailing how to put away a complex board game. We workshopped his search terms to make that search successful. If I'm successful in telling my story should end here. So let's figure out how we're going to get there. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do, or the first thing I'm going to do whenever I tell a story is I'm going to make an opening statement about this story. I typically like to start my stories with something that is blatantly obvious about them. In this case, it's going to be something like, I play board games. Short, sweet, to the point, blatantly obvious regarding my story. So that's my opening statement for the story. Next, I'll provide a supporting detail or two or three. One night, we'd finished playing a really complex board game, and we were trying to put it away. The problem was that we couldn't remember how to put it back in the box. So those couple of details start to flesh out our story a little bit. Now we need some action or an inciting event. This event or action is what causes you to use the skill that you're talking about. Or this is where you reveal what problem could have been avoided if you'd used the skill. So David could not find any pictures of how the board game went back into the box. That's the inciting action. Lastly, we're going to resolve the issue. Explain how you used the skill to solve the problem, or explain how you got through the problem and how using the skill would have helped. David and I discussed the words he was using to search for images. We thought about it for a moment before realizing that we should be using a completely different search term. David swapped out his old search term for this new one, and we were able to get images that helped us put the game away. The last thing I'm going to do is remind my audience why I was telling the story in the first place. So take a little time to workshop your search terms to make sure that they are as specific and correct as possible. It will save you time and more than a headache or two in the long run. There you go. I've mapped out a story I can then use to teach this concept in my classes. It goes like this. I play board games. My game group had finished playing a complex board game one evening, and we were trying to put it back in the box. My friend David was looking up pictures to see how the game went back in the box, but couldn't find any. I talked to him about what words and phrases he was using to search. We workshopped the words and came up with some that might be better or more specific. He tried them and was able to find what we were looking for. Making sure you're using search terms as specific as possible when doing research will save you a headache or two in the long run. So make sure that you're doing it. My story is short, so it won't take up much of my teaching time. It shares something about myself. I play board games. I have a friend named David, things like that. So the students know me a little bit better, which works toward our goal of building a small community in my classroom, which in turn builds a little bit of trust and lets my students know that I care enough about them to share something about myself. This story also shows them how this skill could work in the real world. And I'm sure it was more interesting for them to learn about selectively choosing your search terms this way than if I had just told them to be selective in picking their search terms. Lastly, as short as this story was, I could probably pick a few other concepts that I'm going to be covering that day to teach via a story. And then I'd show them a few more things about myself, which again works toward building that community and trust in my classroom. Now, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to let you all know that these rules, this formula that I created, these are not hard and fast rules. You don't have to have, at least 2 details. You don't necessarily have to resolve the issue the same way that I did, things like that. You could have a more elaborate opening statement, whatever the case may be, or you can take and move these things around a little bit. telling stories and teaching this way is a way for you to kind of, it lends itself to allowing you to kind of build your lesson your way. So again, nothing hard and fast. Feel free to take this and make it your own. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some tips and some takeaways. So the first one, keep it short. You don't have the time to tell a super long story in your classroom, especially if, like most librarians, you're doing a one shot. Now, if you're tackling 3 or 4 classes in a row that are all doing the same thing, you're seeing those kids a couple of times, you have a little bit more time to play with, you could possibly tell longer stories. But as a general rule, try to keep it short, okay? Also, regarding keeping it short, you're sharing a little bit about yourself, not your life story, okay? And make sure that whenever you're building these stories, I think this kind of goes without saying, but well, I say it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Only share stuff that you're really comfortable sharing with your students. Don't feel like you have to give them the deeply personal stuff if you don't want to, okay? Number 2, plan your stories. Don't try to inject stories in the moment. This usually ends up eating up way more of your time than you have to spare, okay? So make sure that you plan it out before you try to stick it into a presentation or a lesson. Also, planning your lessons or planning it out helps you to stick the landing or stick the ending of your story. If you're just making up a story on the spot, it's really, really difficult to stick the ending. And the ending is arguably the most important part of your story, because that's where you're reminding them of why we should be learning this lesson in the first place, okay? Last thing is practice. Enlist a teaching friend to help you practice the story before you get up in front of students, just to make sure that it works, just to make sure that it's quick, and just to make sure that it is fleshed out and makes sense within the context of what it is you're teaching, things like that, okay? So that's it for my presentation. Thank you all for coming. I hope you got something out of it. And now I am open to any and all questions that you may or may not have.
Thank you, Mark. It looks like Erin has a question.
Yes. Hi, Mark. Thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it very much. My name's Erin. I am an instruction librarian at the College Station campus. So I teach information literacy courses. So I was wondering, or classes, sessions. I was wondering if there's a particular topic with information literacy and story that has worked really well for you, that you're like particularly proud of and really helped to get the get it to these students. So that is what I'm curious about.
Okay, so just to recap, you're asking if there's a story that has been particularly effective.
A story and particular information literacy skill or topic that you found particularly effective. So I know every class is going to be a little different for what they're looking for. And some of these topics might be a little more difficult to connect to a story. So both parts of those, if that makes sense.
So the story that I shared with you in my example, I've used that one before, and that typically tends to be pretty effective. It's pretty simple, straightforward, gets the point across. That's part of the reason I shared that one with you. Trying to think. Now that you're putting me on the spot, I don't know if I can think of one. I have shared the story about Jim Bob Billy Bo Jean with other people, and he gets used a lot. Like if there's something that I want to, if there's a lesson that I want to teach, but I don't necessarily have anything that's personal that I can relate it to, I use him as sort of a foil and say that like this thing happened to him, and as a result, this is what you need to know. So you could do that as well as create a character. Gosh, I don't know.
Bruce
David,
gave,
also get you
I'm sorry.
do what?
I can say Bruce gave an example and says, can you tell the group about Marv? Maybe in the context of gale force?
Oh yeah. Okay. So that's fun. So somebody made a mistake once whenever I first started as a librarian. They misheard my name and thought that my name was actually Marv.
Oh,
And so Marv became my pardon the language, dumb alter ego. And so last semester we were teaching about our Gale databases, and when I was teaching about one of the databases, I did a back and forth between Marv and Mark, saying that Mark likes the really highbrow, interesting stuff that is very effective in the Gale databases, and Marv really enjoys the Gale database pieces that do the work for you, like the topic finder and things like that, because he's lazy and he's dumb and things like that. So that's another example of kind of using a story to tell or to teach a lesson, things like that. Does that answer your question? I know that I kind of danced around a little bit and didn't exactly have anything specific.
Yes, that did. It is definitely a lot to think about those in the spot. I'm just thinking of different topics and where I might potentially run into trouble incorporating storytelling and just ways to think it through. So thank you for sharing, and also wanted to mention your jokes throughout the presentation hit. I was laughing in my office, even though
I was laughing too.
I'm so glad.
You had one comment from Chelsea, can you cook a shrimp with a Tesla coil? Divide and conquer.
So that's referencing a presentation that Chelsea and I did this last semester,
Okay.
where we used the example of can you cook a shrimp with a Tesla coil to take a complex quote unquote topic and use AI to divide it up into smaller chunks and then do research about those smaller chunks. And so I guess to that end, Chelsea, thank you for reminding me of that. But having something that's like really off the wall is another kind of form of storytelling, and it keeps your keeps your audience really involved. We actually gave that presentation to a bunch of faculty, and they were enthralled by the idea of can you cook a shrimp with a Tesla coil?
Great idea. We also have Tim Arnold has his hand up.
Yes, sir.
Mark, thanks for your presentation. I wanted to share some years ago, I went to like a leadership conference, and they talked about storytelling and using that for advocacy and things like that, that it's very useful to bring in. I think, it was a few years ago, but what I remember, and it kind of strikes what you're talking about here, is the connection of emotion to, like if you can just give a lot of facts if you're advocating for something, and you can say like this, that, and this was used 800 times or something, but it doesn't really resonate unless you tell like a story, say, of a student using something, and that, kind of retelling stories like that is just very good for as a way of communicating something. People will latch on to that a lot more than numbers, which is, we're so data driven, but are we really? We're more story driven. But I just wanted to share that because it was an interesting revelation at the time. But thanks for your presentation.
Thank you for sharing that. I definitely think that that's numbers are great, data is great, it's all fantastic, but it's also stories provide you with an opportunity to kind of tie that to the real world. I think that's kind of what you're driving at with that statement. So thank you for sharing. I very much agree with that.
Anybody else have any comments, questions? As always, Mark, I really enjoy your presentations. I learned a lot from them.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. I guess actually to that end, in answer to another answer to Aaron's question earlier about a story that I used to teach a concept or something. Last VLT, if you may have attended my presentation last year, I told a story about Marf, who was a first-year teacher who struggled very deeply with imposter syndrome. And you may or may not have caught on to the fact that when I was talking about Marf struggling with imposter syndrome, I was actually telling a deeply personal story to myself. So that presentation, telling that story, made me think that it would be a good idea to do this presentation about the actual act of telling stories and how powerful that can be in your presentations. So
I learned a lot from that last presentation. And so this really helps tie in, and I see you do a wonderful job. I do appreciate it.
thank you. Even though this one ended up being a little bit shy of the time.
That's okay. That's okay. Gives everybody a chance to go get a little bit of drink before lunch and conquer that. I did put a survey link in the chat. If everybody would just take a moment to give a little feedback on this presentation, we appreciate it. And of course, Mark's, not Marf, Mark's email. So, but if you want to talk to Marf, I'm sure he can hook you up.
I do want to say that if you know, I talked about, you know, practicing your story, your presentations and things like that. If you ever need somebody to like bounce a story off of, feel free to get a hold of me. I will be more than happy to listen to your story and help you work through, you know, making it shorter, or tightening it up, or making sure that the ending lands the way you need it to, or things like that. So if you don't have a teaching friend to actually bounce your stories off of, feel free to get a hold of me. I would love to hear your stories. So yeah.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Mark.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for coming again. And I really hope you got
Absolutely.
something out of it. And yeah, I enjoyed doing it. So.
Well, we are done a little ahead. Give everybody a couple minutes to breathe and get ready for the next. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you on the next one.